We took the tram out to Pigeon Key today to take the tour, the historic tour. This is where Henry Flagler's people lived while they built the overseas railroad. So of course it's just tourism now and wildlife sanctuary, but it's a great tram to take if you're ever in the area and interested in the history of how the Keys became accessible to all.
This is about 2 miles offshore from Marathon, which makes it about 5 miles to the other end.
This island is owned by the county and it is leased back to the Pigeon Key Foundation, which is a not-for-profit responsible for all the maintenance on the island. So as you look over your head, I want you to focus on the 2 blue rails that are above your head and ignore everything else that's hanging out over the sides for a moment. And imagine that that's as wide as the train tracks were. The train went to Key West, turned around and came back. There were never any 2-way tracks on the train system. Pigeon Key was a regular stop on the schedule, and just about above your head where you're standing now is where the platform and the depot was, where people were loaded and unloaded and brought down to the island on a lift. Henry was born in 1830. His father was a poor Presbyterian minister, and so at the age of 14 he got a job as a deckhand on the Erie Canal to help support the family. And he made his first fortune in salt mining. Henry was providing salt to the soldiers in the field during the Civil War. But when peacetime came, the bottom fell out of the salt market, and at age 34, Henry was bankrupt. So he returned to Ohio and he opened a second grain business. And it was during that time in Ohio that he ran into someone that he'd gone to school with as a boy in New York, a guy by the name of John Rockefeller, because Rockefeller really admired the way Henry did business. And along with the third partner, the third partner was a physicist, and they established this small little company that you've probably heard of called Standard Oil. And Henry became a very wealthy man a second time in his life. He worked for Standard Oil until he retired in his 50s, and by the time he retired, he had returned to New York and he was running the New York office of Standard Oil. Henry began to visit Florida when he was married to his first wife. He would eventually have 3 wives, but he would have them one at a time. His first wife, Mary Harkins, had health problems, and the doctors recommended the warm climate to Florida, so they began visiting Jacksonville and St. Augustine periodically. At that time, there was nothing in between Jacksonville and Key West. None of Florida had been developed, and none of the Keys had been developed. During his early visits with his first wife, Henry began to think that if there was a nice hotel down here, people would come to Florida. Henry was falling in love with Florida, and he wanted everyone to see it, including his rich friends in New York. So in 1884, he began the first of his grand hotels, a big hotel that he built in St. Augustine, a city that he preferred over Jacksonville. And he finished that hotel in 1888. He called it the Ponce de Leon. It established Henry as the premier developer in the world, and it was the most luxurious hotel in the world at the time it was completed. During the construction of that hotel, Henry expanded his involvement in the rail business because the old Jacksonville-Halifax rail line was so broken down, he couldn't even use it to get construction materials to the work site, and the project was falling behind schedule. And that was unacceptable to Henry. He was a taskmaster, and he wanted things to run on time. So he bought the old railroad so he could fix it up and use it in an effort to finish his hotel on time, which he did. That and the railroad really launched his development career, and he began to build grand hotels all the way through the state of Florida. And he built churches and schools and created whole communities for people to live and work, but his primary focus was building these fancy hotels and, of course, establishing the Florida East Coast Rail Line to give the guests a way to get to his fancy hotels. And Key West had 3 features that were attractive to Henry. At that time, it was the deepest natural port south of Virginia. Second, there was more money in Key West than any other city in the U.S. Per capita, it was the richest city in the country even before the railroad connected them to the mainland. So in 1904, Henry ended the Florida East Coast Rail Line in Homestead, and that business continued to operate until the 1960s, and a platform and a depot would eventually be built in what we now call Miami, but not for many years later. So the business ended in 1904, and Henry announced his plans to take the railroad the rest of the way to Key West, and everyone called him crazy. They thought it was the stupidest idea they've ever heard of. They referred to it as Flagler's folly. They thought he had completely lost his mind and gone right over the deep end. Henry was looking for investors in the U.S. and overseas, and no one would invest with Henry. Henry knew he was going to have to construct 42 bridges from the mainland to Key West, and building a bridge that was 7 miles long was unheard of. No one had ever attempted anything like it before. They said it's impossible, you're never going to finish it, we're not investing. Even in 1904, Henry was estimating $50 million. All of the investors said, thank you very much, we want nothing to do with it. So in 1905, Henry established the Florida East Coast Extension as the sole investor, and he began construction on the railroad by building 82 work camps all along the route so that work could be going on in multiple places at one time. It became the 8th engineering wonder of the world when it was finished. They began construction on the bridge 3 years after the railroad began. They started the bridge in 1908 and expected it to take more than 5 years to build. So by the end of the project, his $50 million estimate reached between $60 to $80 million of his own money to build the overseas railroad. Marathon got its name from that last year and a half of working around the clock. Marathon had been called a bunch of different things. The name kept changing, nothing stuck. But the workers began to refer to this as a marathon project, and it's been Marathon. So I pointed out the blue rails when we stepped under the bridge earlier. Those are the original rails. They're over 100 years old. They are called deck plates. And remember that they started at the other end of the bridge. And so from the end that they started out to the first 1.7 miles, they used a design called spandrel arches. And there are 210 arches in that section of the bridge. From that point, making up the rest of the 5.3 miles of the bridge, they used this deck plate design. And there are 337 pairs from that section making up the 5.3 miles that come from there to Marathon.
When Flagler's workers inhabited the island, it was barren. All plant life came after the fact through conservation efforts.
Limbo tree as the tourist tree because it turns red and peels.
Hurricanes weren't named prior to 1950 and weren't categorized until 1971, so the deadly hurricane that brought about the end of the overseas railroad is just referred to as the Labor Day Hurricane of 1935. It killed 408 people in the Florida Keys.
In addition to that loss of life, the storm took out about 42 miles of track, and that put an end to the overseas railway. Then in 1937, the state of Florida offered Henry's family $640,000 for all of the bridges and the right-of-way to the entire route, and they sold it. So after Henry had invested 60 to 80 million, the family sold it for $640,000. And that's when the Highway of Mirrors was finished right over top. By 1938, the entire highway was finished, and you could travel the 139 miles from the mainland to Key West.
The Florida Keys are dry, meaning that they have no source of fresh water. Every bit of fresh water is pumped in from the mainland. As you drive on the highway, you are actually driving above the pipeline.
So we're going up here. This is the oldest building on the island, and the only one still standing from the original construction was
You may have noticed nearly all of the buildings on Pigeon Key are yellow. Henry Flagler instituted this because he said yellow is a happy color and he wanted his employees to be happy. This shade has actually been named Flagler Yellow. Flagler Yellow is evident here in the on-site museum as well. The museum has a collection of artifacts from the construction of the railroad. Feel free to pause the video to see if you recognize any names on the list.
Then we got stickers. My one.